Hey Heretics, it's your boy, the Warpforge, coming at you with some Nightlord cringe and spicy takes, as the usual. As folks know, I'm still quite a while away from coming back with consistent videos, but seeing a lot of talk, or well, more like the usual sensationalist reactions that you typically see online, looking at you Reddit. It's been a real interesting update that I've seen a variety of reactions and opinions online about, but when it comes to our very best edgy boys of the Traitors Astartes, with a tabletop tactics video made by a chef, making some interesting points as well as Luton's community post, I thought it should be something of worth to have a chat about. So let's have a talk about it and see what we boys in Midnight Clad can do forward to bring out the best and bring down those damn attention-seeking loyalists and Eldar. Yes, I meant what I said, you fucking elves. So if you haven't already seen the Auspex Tactics video, because really, let's be honest here, you've saw that before you've seen this video, then you already have an idea of what these changes are, so I'm just going to give a quick recap for those whose ships have been lost deep in the Sea of Souls. So Dark Obscuration got increased to 18 inches as opposed to their 12 inches. Marks are now coded to mark only, no more transport mixing marks in units. Profane Zeal is rerolls to wound as opposed to the entire hit rolls. Accursed Cultists are now objective control 1, and the Accursed Horde is corrected to the controlling player's command phase. And a lot of points nerfs. Very hard nerfs, especially with Chaos Lords, Chosen, Dark Communes, Forge Fiends to a lesser extent, and Obliterators. There are a few more out there, but in all honesty, like, a lot of them are going to be glanced over. Kind of makes sense. These are just more of the ones that stuck out like a sore thumb. So a few folks who had not seen the entirety of competitive lists may be asking why they have made these changes for Chaos Space Marines. Okay, so to the untrained or the purist, whichever way you want to look at it, these may seem abrupt or unclear, but from my understanding of these lists, it boils down to some very intense rules interactions. As I'll talk, I'll be referring to these combos as chain links. Yes, this is a very pretentious metaphor that will be important later in the discussion. Okay, so the first link in the chain of these lists is the mixing of units. So what folks are doing, we're maxing out Chosen, filling them up with all sorts of manner of close combat weapons, whacking on Marker Khorne or Slanesh, and putting them into a clown car of a Rhino that's been marked by Nurgle, and speeding them into the enemy lines, all happy slappy, or slapping down the Dark Obscuration strat, so that unit cannot be targeted with anti-tank weapons unless they are within 12 inches of the unit. This is essentially making what I call a non-engagement unit to do exactly what it's supposed to do on the table. What do I mean by a non-engagement unit? What I mean by that is this is not a unit you are supposed to interact with. This is a unit that you are just going to have to let happen because it has hard counters that are very absolute, very black and white. It literally says you cannot target this unit unless you're within 12 inches of it. So if you've got things like basilisks or artillery or like biovores, even some anti-tank weapons like las cannons, or I'm just trying to think like some maxed out heavy gauze cannon or whatever, even D-list, even Dean platform fire prisms and such and so forth. If they're not within 12 inches, can't shoot it. You're just gonna have to take it like a good boy, basically. And that's essentially what the Dark Obscuration was doing. It was allowing a delivery package just to go forth and just go, yeah, deal with it. You can't, cool. That's what it's supposed to do. Okay, so that was the first link in the chain. The second link in the chain is the Accursed Cultist and the wonderfully named AC/DC combo. The AC/DC combo is basically a combination of Accursed Cultists tacked on with Dark Communes. The Accursed Cultists will be buffed with the Dark Communes, hence why it's called the AC/DC reference, because they're back in black. Quite preferably Black Legion, but I digress. The buff would be a 5+ invulnerable to the Accursed Cultists, as well as a +1 to hit and to wound, which is huge. So anything that was toughness 7 would be needed to be wounded on a 4+ from the Torments, and such and so forth. Factor in the Dark Pact's ability and their original objective control rating, and you got a meat unit that's tanky, deals hurt in combat, and can stay in an objective if you really want it that bad. Having Feel No Pain and resurrecting units as well, or resurrecting models within the Accursed Cultists for ablative wounds, just to slam down on some meaty targets and just hold ground. It was a unit that could do a lot, and you'd have to concentrate a lot of force concentration in order to wipe out that unit. If you couldn't concentrate on that unit because of other things like the previously mentioned Chosen in the Rhinos and such, well, it sucks to be you, basically. The third link were the Forge Fiends with Ectoplasma Cannons. If you see what an Ectoplasma Cannon can do, high on dark packs, then you know why they're a good all-round artillery unit on legs. The only thing they're missing is the indirect fire to make them a true artillery piece. A lot of people were taking these also with Mark and Nurgle just to have some utility, so once the Chosen got there, if they needed to, they would have an untargetable Forge Fiend, because this guy would just be having a 48-inch range, sitting in the corner, looking down for the best fire lanes, and then just hammering into whatever it can touch. The fourth link, and more an optional link, was Profane Zeal. It was a very effective strat that made rerolls too common with undivided mark units. Obliterators loved this rule because it helped with their swingy dice rolls. So if you've seen the profiles of the Obliterators, they are lovely, lovely profiles. I love them, but a lot of people considered them very swingy or too swingy. They weren't consistent enough because the amount of shots always had to be a roll of a dice. So it was D3, some shots, some profiles had some consistency, such as the blast rule and such and so forth. But all in all, people were saying they're not worth the price at that point, even before the points buff, or well, the points nerfs, because they were just reliant on swingy dice. And when you play to Grand Tournament levels at that high, you want consistency. You're looking up to point, click and delete a unit. You're not looking at rolling and having a bit of a back and forth with the opponent. When you have all these factored into a single list, combining the links into a chain per se, with the Obliterators being more of an option as previously stated, this really made competitive lists reducing probability as close to 0% as possible to get the work down into enemy lists. And indeed, it was a very good way of dealing with the bollocks like the Craftworld Eldar and such and so forth, and all the other bollocks that you're finding out in the Grand Tournament areas. To be quite blunt, it was a good competitive list that dealt with other more popular competitive lists, like the upcoming underdogs being the Necrons, with the Hypercrypt Legion, or Hypercrypt something detachment. I can't really remember the name. I don't have the codex in front of us. I'm going to buy it one day, but I digress. However, Games Workshop does try to address this in terms of getting a better balanced game, to address everything, to hammer them down so that they become a more engaging army to fight against, in the attempt to make them the more an enjoyable experience to play against. Now that Games Workshop has seen the links on the chain, they decide to break these to enforce a wider variety of Chaos Space Marine units to choose from, so Chaos Space Marines don't feel so one-dimensional to play against, and increase the engagement of the list so you feel like you're playing against Chaos Marines and not being your opponent's non-player character, now fighting with now that you're essentially fighting against a variety of different player styles, and with the Chaos Space Marine list roster, rather than just a singular force, one list with against, you know, say 3 Chaos Space Marines using the same thing. Essentially, what this list was doing was essentially making your opponent the non-player character. You are not supposed to engage with this list. You are meant to lose against this list. And whilst that seems to be the objective of the game, it comes at the cost of the enjoyability of the experience. When you have so many hard counters, or if you reduce probability so close to 0% where rolling dice is a waste of time, it's not very good to play against, because you know that the game ends in black and white. If you don't do X, Y, and Z against this list, you know for a fact with almost empirical data that they're going to demolish. They're going to just point X, Y, and Z and click and delete something in kind. In terms of a Grand Tournament, it might be okay for their standards against everything else. It's a very unenjoyable experience, and I'm pretty sure there's probably a few Grand Tournament people who may watch this video or listen in, and they might even agree that even at Grand Tournament level, fighting against such a list that you have no real interaction with is not an enjoyable experience. So with the changes mentioned earlier, they broke those links to break the chain. Great! Splendid, right? Well, this is where the instant reactions come around and the following fallout that ensues. With these changes, there are some units that are also caught in the crossfire as well. Chef from Tabletop Tactics brought an interesting point to the conversation with how Games Workshop do things. I remember a while ago watching one of the Meta Watch videos, the head of the 40k studio, I believe it's Stu, but I could be wrong, but I believe his name was Stu. And the way he described how they try to address balance is that they try to think 5 steps ahead, because they're trying not to just solely think of the Grand Tournament areas, but they're also thinking about the standard game that you and I could have, or a pickup game could have. They're trying to think preemptive ways of not being too controlling and not being too overboard with dealing too many actions or nerfs, but they also have to be very aware that when they do nerf something else is going to take precedent, and they need to make sure that they don't reach the same end goal that the previous thing they nerfed did. However, Chef also points out in their video, to contrast with the MetaWatch videos, that in their balanced data slate video that they spoke about, them being ex-playtesters themselves, allegedly, from Chef's words, they listen to very small circles and taunt officials for feedback. Now this I understand, but Chef also brings in a valuable point in the video that their idea of trickle-down balance doesn't work. All it does is punish those players who aren't playing with a Grand Tournament focus or playing at the extreme standard for a living, like 40k coaches for example. And so those who are using a portion of those lists are actively punished for those who aren't playing to those high standards, which the wider 40k community. And as an example, this really reflects with Obliterators and Warp Talons. With the mindset that Games Workshop has, from what's been said in their MetaWatch videos, they have tried to curb another upcoming unit list with Obliterators, which could have potentially created the same ends through different means, an unenjoyable or uninteractive gaming experience. Warp Talons also got shafted because they were very clearly used in one Grand Tournament, and Games Workshop curbed them to stop a preemptive rise in the usage of that unit just in case. All this really reflects in Chef's resolution. Games Workshop do balance in absolutes. Games Workshop do not just try to break the chain per se. They try to stop the next alleged list from rising, and this is an extreme because ultimately Games Workshop, they don't truly say the future. Games Workshop is not clairvoyant, and in doing so they get rather ham-fisted with stomping the preemptive strikes. A blitz would have made some impact, but what made them very good for their expensive point costs, and this is before we get into the points nerfs to boost, or the points boosts to Obliterators, they were already expensive, and then they nerfed the Prevain Zeal strat, which they heavily clutched on to make them so consistent. And then Games Workshop made them even more expensive. So not only did Games Workshop just nerf the strat that made them consistent, they also made them so expensive that people are very rarely going to take them, if at all, within the terms of the competitive circuit. Warp Talons are very good at their role, but they require some skill to get the most out of them, even in a Grand Tournament level. The person who won the Grand Tournament played very well to get where they were, and then they got more expensive. They're only still 2. They have an invulnerable save, which is decent, but the only 2 wounds with 3+, Volume of Fire can still shred them apart. There's a question that Games Workshop overdoes it with the balance, and part of me feels this really feels like Games Workshop get as paranoid as the Inquisition at this point. Going back to the links in the chain metaphor, as pretentious as it may be, you're welcome. The links are there. Games Workshop have identified the links in the chain that made the entire chain, which was what made them so uninteresting or unenjoyable. They nerfed them in the balanced data slate and or in the design rules commentary, or the rules writers commentary, whatever it was called. They've nerfed it. They broke the chain there and then. And then came the points boosts, and that's the problem. Once you've broken the chain, you don't need to go any further. The things that required obvious points boosts is fair, but when you've broken such tight consistency down, most of them didn't really need, or some of the units didn't really need half the points boosts that they did. With the dust now settled, what can we do as we stand in Midnight Clad? What can we use to pull back and bring the fight? Honestly, I guess that's the $1 million question right now. It's very early to tell. I feel we have some tools to play with. We've got Plasma Raptors. They look appealing for Deep Strike for deployed teleport homers, and they're a good little suicide unit just to take out some Terminators. You slap mark of undecided on them, you'll be fine. Overcharge those plasma guns, have fun. I also feel triple Predator Destructors could be a good shout as well. For their points, with rerolls to 1 to wound on monsters and vehicles, people are bringing bigger things. I can't contain or say that this is the messiah of the next list. I don't think triple Preds are that at all. But I do feel as though they're worth something to look at now. They're a good shout. But ultimately, I feel folks will just double down on Forge Fiends. Forge Fiends turned from a very cheap to a very fair price, and I feel folks will still pay a fair price as opposed to the Obliterators, in which I feel they have hammered out into the overpriced bracket now. If they weren't already, they certainly are now. Chosen will be replaced by regular Legionaries, also known as Legos within Chaos Space Marine and the Night Lords communities. We like our Legos. I feel we will see more screens for cultists, as cultists have sticky and cheap sticky. So they have cheap objective control and keep hold of an objective, and that is nice when it's spammed out for meat grinder effects. Quantity is quality after all. Guard players and all that very well. So when it comes to the cultists, they're not very much use in terms of aggression, but in terms of playing to the objectives, which I believe is where we should be really looking forward to. We're looking at the tactical objectives now in the Leviathan season. Look at them, look at the boards, look at what your tournament area, or if you are playing tournaments, look at what your tournament is bringing. If it's sticking to a particular style of game board like the WTC boards or ITC, have a look if your general gaming area is more just about playing to the Games Workshop standard of terrain layouts. Look at the board, look at what objectives are going forward, how can you max out on your objectives, both your primary and your secondary. Look at the primary objectives that you're going to be playing with in your area, look at the secondaries if you are, of what you're playing with, and think how can you get as many points from what you wish to play with as possible. Then play as accordingly, so just put the units that you feel will succeed or get those objectives done within a turn. My final thought on this data slate is that I don't feel Chaos Space Marines are as dead as folks like to cryptically renounce on Reddit. Sure, we have definitely been wounded, and I do feel absolutely fucking salty over the points increase to Obliterators and Warp Talents, as I really feel they didn't need it in regards to the links in the chain being broken in the balanced data slate. But neither do I feel the need to knock out a keyboard crusade on Daka Daka either. I don't see us going down hard, not at least without a fight. Our win ratio will deplete, but I feel the loss will be marginal. We might go down to 48 to 50% is my best stab in the dark about it. We still have Dark Pacts, and I think you will see that be more clutch, and I also see folks going to be more of mark of undivided or undecided to bring back some form of aggressive consistency, because rerolling ones is quite neat when it's an army-wide ability. When it comes to Chaos Lords being spammed and marks mixing happening, I could see that a mile off coming. So I find it hard to empathise with folks clutching those combos. I mean, I'm just going to be honest, it was as dirty as the Exalted 8-bound going into a Rhino Clown Car style, so if you're upset because you made heavy use of that combo, then I'm sorry, but you get no sympathy from me. As Joachim Phoenix once said, you get what you fucking deserve. It was clearly an oversight. I can't remember an edition that ever changed or deviated from that. I can't remember an edition where I would put Mark of Khorne Chaos Space Marines inside of a Mark of Slaanesh Rhino, for example. It just never happened. So this feels like it was just a clear oversight that was exploited by a grand tournament level of player. It was always going to be temporary. I just don't see it. I could never see it undiagnosed, just going under the radar. I just don't see it. Just never saw it happening. And like I say, with the data slate, it's finally been addressed. The only thing I was surprised about was the fact that, talking more about loyalists here, the Black Templar Librarians are still under the radar. So what I mean by that is that in the Righteous Crusaders detachment, you can't take Psychers. Okay? Black Templars do not have an army-wide rule that allows them to not be able to take Psychers. So, if you pick, say, the Iron Hill detachment or the Firestorm detachment, for example, any of this bog standard Space Marine detachments, not only can you play with all Black Templar units, you can have Terminator sort librarians or standard librarians given a 4-up invulnerable save to a unit of, say, Black Templars. Yeah, It's another exalted 8-pound car. Well, yeah, it is definitely another exalted 8-pound clown car situation. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. I hope it doesn't really become a thing for Black Templars or becomes a really competitive option, because come on, folks, librarians and you Black Templars, purge the witch, abhor the fucking witch. I digress. That's the salt coming. What I do feel as though it does raise a bigger point through the use of these data slates and how they affect the community, as per Luton's post. It feels as though that a lot of discussion about people feeling as though they can't keep up. There's a lot of changes, and even Tabletop Tactics reflects this with the Dark Angels points, how they technically have their codex in the limited edition boxes, but that Dark Angels codex has not been widely released as a standard codex yet, which basically means that the points update for them both applies to the index cards and the codex, but the codex already has its own points in the book, and the confusion generates, which I totally understand. There's a lot to say there, and I think there's a lot to discuss about that, but I honestly feel that is a meatier video for another time. And with that, I want to know how you feel. What do you think about this balanced data slate? I've said my thoughts. I feel as though I've been very precise with my thoughts. How do you all feel about the balanced data slate? What do you make of it? This is the Warp Forge, signing out, and remember, keep on forging.